Thank you. Maybe I should thank the journalists for being here again. You're part of a certain mission. You're not just journalists, you're development agents, because you have a continent you have to look after. And everyone looks after it in his own ways. Bankers look for money, journalists have to get the message across, ask the difficult questions. By the end of the difficult questions, still get the development message across. And so we're very glad that you have come to meet Afreximbank and meet African states, African corporates producing trading companies to discuss African trade. So thank you for coming. The AFCFTA was an instrument given to us by African states. The question of trading amongst ourselves is not new. It was in the Lagos Plan of Action in 1982. It was in the declarations of the African heads of states when the Organization of African Union was created in 1963. So it's a mission which we all have had to do. In Afreximbank, we just thought that we had to take it one step forward. And we were very happy that that momentum was already amongst our African leaders, the heads of states, the ministers of trade, the ministers of economy. They all came together and they have the treaty. But the treaty itself is just a set of words, of letters, of rules. What makes the change is our attitude to that treaty. Other than the treaty driving it, the real message behind the treaty, other than its words about the tariffs you should lift, the custom barriers you should try and shift or make accommodations so that the goods can move freely, other than the infrastructure that it's going to call to put that in place, the AFCFTA is primarily a call for us to produce. There is no, you're not going to trade unless you have something to sell and you want to buy something. So you must produce what you want to trade. Unless you produce, you cannot trade. So the AFCFTA, ZECLAF as it is known in French, is a call for Africans to go out and produce. That's the real mission of the AFCFTA. And in Afreximbank, we have taken that seriously. Over the coming years, we've decided that as part of our next phase of the strategy, we will concentrate on processing. Unless you process, you will not have the things to sell. You will continue to sell raw cassava to get it into the simplest form of it, but into more complex things. You will continue to sell bauxite in its raw form, iron ore in its raw form. You continue to sell copper in its raw form. You continue to export crude petroleum. You continue to do latex rubber in its raw form. So all of that is what we think in Afreximbank needs to stop. And we believe the AFCFTA is an opportunity to do so. It's a massive call by the government. Now, in processing, governments don't have to worry. The private sector has the resources. What the private sector and Afreximbank require from government is just get the civil servants to give the approvals when they are required. We would bring the management skills and bring the money to make sure that the processing takes place. But let me say something about processing. Quite often, and in our own studies we've conducted over the last 5 years, there's too much emphasis on infrastructure. And the emphasis is put in terms of the government having to build infrastructure, which means the government takes from its budget. But the budget, as you know, has other priorities. They have to deal with hospitals, they have to deal with schools, they have to deal with civil servants, they have to deal with emergencies. all those social interventions are what governments who specialize in. We think that certain infrastructure will be built with the right form of processing. We went to Guinea and we looked at the bauxite processing. We have looked at bauxite processing in Cameroon, in 3 countries in the continent. And simply, if you were going to process bauxite, the actual cost of producing the bauxite from the raw material, getting it out of the ground, the actual cost is only about 20% of the total cost of doing the bauxite, having the bauxite processed. So you have to set up an aluminium factory. For some countries, like Cameroon, it already exists. So all you do is you refurbish and update it. But bauxite takes plenty of power. So if you produce plenty of power, you probably should do so for your bauxite entity and extra. The extra you put into the power grid. So you improve the infrastructure on power without asking the government to do so. And when you do so, you also construct the transmission lines. And so you're dealing with transmission lines for one product, because of one product. And for that same product, you'll have to do a road from where you are mining the bauxite to perhaps the nearest rail link. That's a road infrastructure. The rail link itself would need to be enhanced so that you can take it from there to the processing plant. And that processing plant, that rail link, it's also infrastructure. You can use it for the transport of the bauxite and the transport of passengers and the transport of other commodities. Then, after you've processed it, you have to ship it. That means you have to build a porting facility. So you're building a port infrastructure. All of that based on that mineral. The minerals are there for us to use to improve the situations in our countries. So you're using a mineral to improve the infrastructure, while at the same time exporting processed bauxite at a value which is significantly, sometimes 10 times, sometimes 100 times even, as you would see in textiles. So you deal with the infrastructure while you make money, also you get better value out of what you sell from your refined products. So we believe that processing is what we should do. Multiply that to iron ore. When you take the iron ore to steel, that one, the rail infrastructure required for that is really extensive. And if you do it as a regional project, it means you have to put a rail infrastructure in the countries where the same deposit is shared amongst a number of countries. It works. Wood processing is the same. Just think of latex. If you were going to do rubber in Cote d'Ivoire, or rubber in Congo DRC, or in Cameroon, or in Liberia, which is very strong also in rubber. If you decided to begin to manufacture vehicle tires out of that rubber rather than export the raw rubber, then in the process, you're also going to put some infrastructure in place which will be paid for by the value of the exported rubber. It will no longer come out of government's budget. Then you increase the value of the turnover, and therefore the value that the government can tax and get more money. Then you create more work. That work itself, as you pay the employees, you also tax some of it because they all have to pay tax on their salary. So you increase the tax base, but people are at work, and all those people who are at work, they are also suppliers to the entity. So the knock-on effects onto other sectors is quite significant. So previously, the story was from our partners from abroad. If you ask them to process manganese in Gabon, or you ask them to do phosphate in Togo, they told you there was no power, and so they couldn't do it. But this was just an excuse. We can't buy that any longer at this pace. If they say it is no power, we build a power station for them. And perhaps we'll just build an entire processing zone specialized for manganese with all the infrastructure so that they stay in there and then they begin to export at a higher value for the benefit of our countries. And in Gabon, I can say to you, the government is very determined to do so right away, and we too are determined to support them. So the ZECLAF in French or AFCFTA in English is actually not just the rules that we are trying to put in place, the governments are putting in place to ease the trade amongst African countries. It is primarily a call and an opportunity for us to produce and process. Unless we produce and process, there will be nothing to sell to ourselves or to sell abroad to increase our export revenues.
Standing together, representing forever, we are transforming Africa's trade.
The IATF itself too was a call of African heads of states at the first meeting of the Organization of African Unity. And so the first one was organized and then left to follow. But the subsequent IFTF, which Afreximbank started, was also a response to the call by African heads of states to make sure that the trade fairs happened. But why the trade fairs? It's just so that you can demonstrate to Africans in other parts of the continent, they meet together and they see the capabilities of other parts of Africa. It is, as a means, it's commercializing what we have. If you produce, you go to the trade fair and you display, then that makes it possible for us to know what is happening elsewhere. But this is just one way to address the overall need to trade. A payment system also has to support that. The production that we refer to and the infrastructure that goes with it is part of the process of supporting that. So the IATF is only one item in a series of many that Afreximbank is trying to address so as to ease that trade amongst African countries. And the success of these trade fairs speaks for itself. That's why we repeat them. Where is the success? In the previous two, the level of contracts signed were in the region of 40 billion. And in Afreximbank, we take particular care to keep a record of those trade deals being signed at the IFTF. We follow them up, and those ones that need financing, we finance them. Those which can be financed better by local banks because of the size involved and the nearness to the parties, we then provide lines of credit for those local banks to do so. And we do keep a record of how those are performing. Our performance rate is somewhere around 80%. That's extraordinary. If you have deals of $40 billion and 80% of those deals are carried on from start to end, and the trade actually occurs, then that's a remarkable success. And if only for that particular reason, that every 2 years you generate somewhere around $44 billion worth of trade, and then you execute somewhere around 35 billion. If only for that, every 2 years, you should do the trade fair. So we think it's something which is extremely useful for us as a means of sending the message across that Africa has to trade with itself. But beyond Africa, you could see from the trade fair here in Algiers that you now have exhibitors, private sector from Switzerland, plus the Swiss state system, the Canadians, the Russians, they're coming from all over the world now to exhibit in this. Private and public sector. Usually private sector would go because for them they see an opportunity. But when the public sector also begins to take part, the public sector, which is non-African, then it's beginning to tell you that for them, this trade fair is also of strategic importance. Strategic importance, which is the message they are giving, that they would like to see Africa turn towards their own products and turn to trading with them in a strategic manner. So we thank you people for trying to get this message across. Try and do so most critically, but the message must go across that this is a trade fair to seek to resolve some of the challenges of African trade.
Standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa's trade. Oh.
Technology, innovation, that's the mantra today. It seems to us actually that it is perhaps with what we describe as the creatives, it is one of the easiest means to reach out to the young and to just ordinary market women trading across the African frontiers. As you trade and you produce to trade, the very first thing that comes to mind, even before you start to transport the trade or you open the barriers as ZECLAF is supposed to do, what comes to mind first is how to pay for the trade. It has to be paid for first. And we thought that that could be driven by technology. We're now trading on our telephones, trading on our iPads, sometimes trading on our wristwatches. So perhaps the Pan-African payment system was done specifically to address that. And again, look at the foresight of the African leaders. We tend to think that they do nothing, they have no vision. In 1963, again in the very first meeting of the African Organization of African Union, now the African Union, the heads of states called for the establishment of a Pan-African payment system. This is over 60 years ago. We're only just doing so now. What else do you expect from them as foresight? Foresight is there. It's for the rest of us now to take the momentum and get away with it. And that payment system in modern times involves tremendous innovation. The technology platform you build for that, the softwares, applications you have to use for that. But incidentally also, you need the participation of the states to accept, to join that payment system, the central banks. And that's the job we're currently doing, to get as many of the central banks in the countries to join the Pan-African payment system so that we can ease trade between African countries in local currencies. And you just have to think about being in, Ken, you say you're in Lagos, but you were in Nairobi previously. Just think about trading between Lagos and Nairobi. We want to be in the situation in which you do that trade without necessarily having to go through a complex currency somewhere else. So you pay for the items in Naira in Nigeria, and your seller in Nairobi receives shillings, and you get the goods. So that's what the payment system is about. We think that's a significant innovation, and it is growing in size. And you now have to speak to big corporates like MTN and Ethiopian Airlines. You see the value that the payment system has come to add. They usually carry large volumes in different countries, and they need to move them around. The capacity to have Naira in Nigeria and be credited with Rand in South Africa is extraordinary for them. It's also extraordinary for the normal woman who is moving from Cotonou, is trying to sell from Cotonou to Conakry. That movement itself is something which we think can only be done if you have the appropriate technology-driven platforms.
Standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa's trade.
It's perhaps the most difficult sub-region and across the continent in many ways. So everything is low. The regional integration is slower. The trade within itself is slower. But the strategy in Central Africa is the same strategy we have for the continent. And perhaps this time is going to work better and faster in Central Africa than that sub-region than anywhere else. It is loaded with all these minerals we've been talking about. And I think the governments are now significantly more conscious of the need to do that processing. So I don't know if you were taking the Cameroon of my friends there, all those minerals I mentioned, bauxite, iron ore, rubber, wood, cotton, I don't know what else. They are there, and the processing of these items is extremely easy. So the strategy that we have adopted to make sure that this works, that's our intention. That's where we have dedicated resources now, financial and human. But beyond those, you need a strategy for that to work. And our strategy is now to interact with the government a little more closely than as mere investors coming to seek investment opportunities to make money. For us, this is a question of development. This is a question of our own dignity as Africans. And because it's a question of dignity, we now have to go to the government, sit down with the government, and have a proper discussion with them as to how to move that. From our analysis, we believe that the civil service in the countries are the greatest setback to it. And working with the civil service to go around it would be extremely useful. And by civil service, I mean simple approvals. You need an approval for this. If it's supposed to take 1 week, there is no need for it to take more than 7 days. In fact, if it's supposed to take 1 week, perhaps they can issue it in 3 days. They have to cut the red tape, and only at the top will that happen. In Gabon, the head of state has understood that, and the steps he's taking to make sure that certain things happen. The power system he promised, and we told him his civil service was the problem, and he told us the civil service is no longer the problem. So within 2 months, we're now going to sit down. We're now going to open the setting up of his first power station. We promised 3. We found the money for 3. He told us that he wanted the 3 in 6 months, and we're going to give it to him in 6 months. But that's because he's decided that he will not be held back by the civil service. And so we have to find a way to have that dialogue with the civil service. Things must move fast. They can no longer sit on laws about appropriateness of doing things, but nothing is done. So we have to do the things, make some mistakes in the process. If you get 75 or 80% achievement with some drawbacks counting for 25%, you fix them as you go. You cannot fix all those things and make sure it is all right and straight before you begin to execute. That process is probably good for certain fields like medicine, but for the production and processing we're talking of, the civil service must become part of that process. And sometimes it means that they change the law. We're tired of hearing them say, this cannot be done because there is a ministerial order, an arrêté of 1970 or of 1965. And they proudly go to the minister and say, it's not possible. No, we want the civil servant, when he realizes that it cannot be done because of a certain arrêté, he should prepare the arrêté which modifies that one, the draft, and take to the minister and say, this is what is stopping us, this is what we want you to sign. And the minister will take to cabinet and tell the rest of the ministers and his colleagues in government, this is what we need to do. Cabinet approves it and he signs it, so that you have a ministerial order which reverses the previous one which was stopping us. We cannot now delay our development. There is money. It used to be the issue, we were told, but we just found out that it's not money. There is the will. So we have the means, we have the will. We must force the civil servants to join us in that process. Take this message out to the civil servants in very clear terms. It's not a battle, we're not putting a challenge to them, but we want them to become part of a certain movement. We will be coming to them in those countries in Central Africa. If we're going to do manganese in Gabon, we do not want the civil servants in the Ministry of Mines to tell us the reasons why it cannot be done. They should tell us there's a complication here, but here's the solution. That's how we want to go with it, and so that we can move and have these processes done. So we believe that Central Africa, the situation is going to change. The percentages you see will improve, and the improvement wouldn't be something that journalists would have to communicate again. Normal people going to work on a daily basis in a manganese processing unit, in a wood processing unit, in a textile industrial zone, will see for themselves, for their own personal well-being, and the story, all of that would speak for itself. So that's the strategy. The strategy we have for Central Africa is the same strategy elsewhere. But in Central Africa, it is going to require a much personal touch, regular visits to the government, prime ministers, heads of state, ministers responsible, so that we can get the civil service moving in those countries. Yes, it sounded a little hostile, but in reality, when you meet the ministers, you will not be so aggressive. You find a way to get the message across with a beer or palm wine, as it is, some tea, but we have to be passionate about it. We just can't leave it again, so that we are told perpetually by other kinds of investors that they cannot process manganese in Gabon because there is no power. It's no longer acceptable. We have to do something about it. Or you cannot process wood in Cameroon because there is no, I don't know what, but we've already created an industrial zone in Gabon which is doing the wood processing successfully, and done one in Benin which is doing the textile processing successfully, and in Benin the returns to the country are over 1,000%. So it's doable.
Standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa's fate.
That's a difficult one. We probably have to see it on a one-to-one without the cameras and the lighting and so on, so that we can get it across. But perhaps it's largely a question of trust. Afreximbank was built up as a very small family from the start. The traditional start of a multilateral organization like Afreximbank, whether it's a political organization like the African Union or the Organization of African Unity at the time it was created, or a financial institution, is that they start on a large base. You create the institution, you give it a secretary general, you give it a president, you appoint the vice president, you appoint the... So you start with a large number of staff, huge departments, and you therefore do not have time to develop a culture. In Afreximbank, we started with a very slim team. The assets had grown to 500 million, and there were still only about 20 people managing all of these. And we say 20 people, we mean from driver to the president. So we learned to trust ourselves. And trust was at the basis of all of that. Trust of the then president to the rest of the staff, and the trust the staff had in him. Now, the effect of trust is that staff are able to speak to senior management more openly, more critically, and they are also feel free to do certain things and make some mistakes. In banking, mistakes could be extremely fatal because the money is gone, you don't recover it again. But there is still scope for certain corrections to be made, And that trust, in the same way that we have trusted you, is what is made of Afrexim Bank. The second issue is the mandate. Because it was a smaller group, it was also easier to inculcate into the staff the idea that we were extremely privileged to be those selected to do the job which the bank is doing. So the staff in Afrexim Bank, they work with a certain inbuilt humility in them, is that we feel that it is not a right to work in Afrexim Bank. We've been given a privilege. So for that privilege, there is something you must give back. To give back, you have to work together. And when we work with you, the journalist, the attitude is the same that we take to the accountants, to the lawyers, to the advisors. We make it clear to them that they will make money. Just like you will have the news items. You will see the good and the bad. But unless you share our convictions that Africa and the wider African diaspora, everywhere it is suffering certain indignities. Unless you share that conviction with us, we will not be able to work with you. If you share that conviction and you believe that something has to be done to make a difference, then we would work with you, regardless of how hostile or friendly you would be. So long as you share that conviction, then we have a basis for trust. We can then trust you and live with you. This is perhaps a conversation we should have out of this, but since you have the cameras on, the emphasis on, we believe in Afrexim that we were privileged to work here. It was not a right, it's a privilege, and that privilege can be taken away at any time. So we're holding it on a tight rope. If it leaves, then we are not part of that momentum. So everyone is holding on it. The next item is trust. We think that we have to trust each other for things to work. And so that trust is what is developed, that very generous spirit you see amongst the staff working together as a team. That's because they do not worry about what the other person is going to think of them if they say or do certain things. They just go wrong and someone else covers for them.
Standing together, we prepare to forever. We are transforming Africa's fate.
The next phase is the present phase. You're going to drive global Africa. You start in the continent itself. You must create wealth. Unless we create the wealth and people begin to feel good about it, global Africa would be perhaps just a feast you organize every 2 to 3 years, people come and dance and so on. So creation of wealth, and when you create the wealth, then you can share the wealth with the rest of Africa, which is the global Africa, the Africa in the diaspora, the Africa in the Caribbean, in the Americas, the Africans in Japan, the Africans in South America, and so on. And how do you create the wealth? Creating the wealth, you have to process. You must take these commodities and process them to create the wealth. That's the direction we're going now. Over the next 5 years, we're going to focus on wealth creation. And wealth creation to us means putting the investment in the processing of our commodities so that they create jobs, they increase the tax base, they increase the infrastructure, and they make people just feel good about themselves. And that feel good is what is going to enhance global Africa.